Plaster carving is one of my all-time favorite sculpture lessons, and in this video I will walk you through how to pour plaster, how to carve an organic shape, then how to go back in with details, and then finally how to spray your plaster so it lasts forever and how to attach it to a wooden base. This video is super long. I decided to leave in all the footage, and so skip ahead if there's parts you don't need to see. I will narrate some, but not all of the video. I'm just keeping in all the footage in case there's an area that you want to see me do a little bit slower, and you can pause and go at your own pace. I have included materials links in my description box if you're interested in what tools we used. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a weekly tutorial. Before you learn how to carve plaster, you have to pour plaster into a mold. Pouring plaster, you will use the recipe 2 parts plaster to 1 part water. We use plaster of Paris, which you can buy on Amazon, you can find at Walmart, BlakeArtMaterials.com, and pretty much anywhere that you find art supplies. Make sure you have 1 measuring unit, like a cup, and you're gonna need something to stir your plaster with. We used a giant bag of plaster of Paris, so we scooped out using a styrofoam cup, and that was our cup or unit of measurement. You want to make sure you break up any clumps of plaster before you pour it to the water, and you want to always add your water first and then add your plaster to the water while you're gently stirring. As you stir, it should resemble thick pancake mix. My students always feel like they're making breakfast when we do this. Once you have a good thick mix in your container, you're going to gently tap it on the table so the air bubbles rise to the top and don't create weak spots when you're carving. I don't have a video of this, but here are some pictures of when we did this in the classroom. So we mixed it in a giant bucket and then poured it in 3 or 4 containers. You could also mix it directly into the container that you're using, and then you could do it like 1 person at a time. So if you're a teacher, figure out what works best for you. And if you're doing this at home, you can mix directly into the container. That way you have more control of how much plaster that you have. You also really need to wear safety goggles and a mask because you do not want to be breathing in a bunch of plaster. And if you don't think a droplet of plaster can land in your eyeball, I'm here to tell you from experience that it can and it will. Once your plaster has been poured in the mold, you need to let it set before you release it from the mold. Now this is going to vary depending on temperature, depending on climate, and depending on how long you're letting it set. This is sat in a cubby overnight, and you can do this 45 minutes after you pour it. Keep in mind, larger containers will take longer to set, and smaller containers will take shorter. So if you're just pouring like a small little mold, you can be ready to take it out of the mold in like 30 minutes. But we're doing plaster carving, so the set time and the cure time varies depending on the size and shape of your mold. Before carving, I like to sketch out my design onto my plaster itself so I have a roadmap of where I'm going. Here's a really great student example of how she made sketches in her sketchbook. Then she took her favorite sketch, and you can do multiple angles because remember this is 3D. Then she drew it directly onto her mold, keeping in mind the shape and size. So trace the mold that you're going to use, and then you can start the carving process. Eventually, it should not look flat, but it should look really 3-dimensional like you can see in these photographs here. I was really impressed with this student, and here's her finished result, at least one angle of it. It doesn't look rectangular at all. She did a beautiful job of creating negative space and an interesting sculpture all the way around. Here are the tools I'm using, mostly small handheld rasps, metal carving tools, and a few loop tools as well. I'll put a link to my favorite tools in this description box so you can see what we have been using in my classroom. I am using a rasp or something that looks like a cheese grater to remove large chunks of plaster. My plaster is super soft, easy to carve, and one trick if you want your plaster to be very easy to carve, add a little bit more water than the recipe calls for. The more plaster you add, the harder it's going to be, which is a great end result but really difficult for carving. The rasp is almost the wrong tool to use. If you look up where the plaster is gathering, the plaster is so wet that it's really kind of gunking up the plaster. So you would want to tap this in the trash can and then rinse it in warm water, not pouring the extra plaster down the sink. So I like to have a cup of warm water that I'll kind of like swirl my tool around, wipe it down with a paper towel, and then like pour it out in an outdoor space or somewhere that's not going to clog your sink, like a bag. So as you can see, I am turning my plaster around in my hand and I'm kind of carving aimlessly. And I'll be honest, I have a couple ideas of how I want this to look, but unlike my fabulous student example in the beginning of this video, I'm kind of just going for it. I know that I want to do organic shapes, and I have a couple different ideas. Trees has been an inspiration for my artwork lately, and also under the sea, like a coral reef, seaweed, kind of like the beautiful plant shapes that you find in the ocean. We'll see where this turns up. If you don't have rasps or carving tools, you can do this with clay loop tools or a simple butter knife. So I don't want you to feel like if you don't have really expensive sculpture tools, you can't do this. Be creative, think outside the box, get out a butter knife, even a spoon, and you can carve plaster when it's soft super easily. I'm using a metal loop tool. This is actually not from my clay loop tools. I am going to use some of those eventually. This one has a little bit of a different edge to it, and it's really doing a beautiful job of carving shapes the way I want them to be. You will notice in this video that I use mostly my loop tools. I use these little carving tools that make me think of the dentist, and I use rasps. I don't use a chisel and a hammer, and you can do it that way, and I've done that with alabaster stone before, but you have to be really aware of points and counterpoints when carving with a chisel. My background is ceramics. That was my focus in college, and that is what I have the most experience teaching. So I kind of always revert back to what I know, which is carving down clay, and that's what I feel comfortable using, and so that's what this video will focus on. One thing I always encourage is negative space or holes or empty pathways in your sculpture. This makes a really interesting artwork to look at, and it just makes it more multidimensional. And I do encourage doing small negative space areas first. Don't try and go too big, because if you break your plaster in half, it's not like you can't fix it, but it is really challenging. And I'm using one of these tools that came in my sculpture carving kit that makes me think of going to the dentist. And so I'm just kind of freehanding it and letting areas kind of jut out, and I'm going to carve some holes and areas in. I highly recommend having an idea and a sketch and a plan, but if you don't have one, this can be challenging to think abstractly. So sometimes just like carving and seeing what happens can be very liberating, but I think most of my students felt more comfortable and more successful when they had more of an idea of what they wanted the end result to look like, knowing that it can change as you go. So I'm making this one area kind of jut out, and you can see I carved my hole there, and I'm going to try and make that go all the way through and come out on another side. Again, the weaker your plaster is, the more likely it's going to break. So I don't want to like Swiss cheese my sculpture at the very beginning. I want to make sure it's very stable before I carve too much going through. So like I said, this organic shape makes me think of coral, and I do have that idea in my mind. And one thing that is difficult, you can see this is from an angle overhead. So you have to kind of sketch out what you want it to look like, but then the sculpture emerges from the center of your plaster and not just like one side of it. So if you're using a rectangular shape like an orange juice container, that can be kind of tricky. At least with a round shape like a styrofoam cup, at least it's already round. And so that takes away some of that front back mindset that so many people have, because we're just kind of used to making more two-dimensional art. So it definitely takes a little bit of thought process. It kind of hurts your brain. Before you know it though, the more you carve, the more your sculpture comes to life, and just trust the process. Plaster, timing is everything. So make sure when you set your plaster in the mold that you are ready to carve in 45 minutes or the next day if you're doing this in a school setting. If you wait, your plaster can get really hard, and it can be much more challenging to carve. Now we did this in several batches, and some of my students, their plaster set, it was really hard to work with, like on the second and third day. And some students carved it for like 2 weeks, and it remained like this, like super easy to carve. I'd love to be able to tell you why exactly that is. I have a feeling it's the ratio of water. And if you keep your plaster in a bag and in an enclosed space like a cubby or a cabinet, it seems to set or cure a little bit slower. So as you see, I'm still just kind of aimlessly carving, trying to make it not the cone shape of the styrofoam cup, but having areas that recede or go in, and then keeping areas that stick out. So again, I'm freehanding this, but if you had a sketch, you would plan each angle and turn it around in your hands and try and let the whole thing develop as a whole. It's a little scary until you've done one, and then you really have a roadmap. One thing we did that I felt was successful is that my students practiced by doing soap carvings first. This is such a great way for students to practice thinking abstractly, thinking in the round, or a sculpture that is interesting from all sides, and the pitfalls of making areas too thin, then breaking, or just carving your sculpture into nothingness. Carving, if it's not too hard, is really satisfying, and so you want to be careful that you don't just go into sensory overload where you just keep carving and carving and carving, and before you know it, you have no block of plaster left. So practicing with soap was a really great technique to get my students in the right mindset before jumping into a more difficult material, because carving, that's a subtractive process, can be really hard to understand, and abstract designs can be really hard to understand too. At this point, I'm starting to get a really interesting form, and I really like these areas that kind of cave into each other. So I'm going to try some negative space that goes all the way through and connect some of these holes to make almost like little cave areas to break up my form even more. You always want to turn your sculpture around in your hands, and mine is round, so I'm looking at it all the way around. But if yours is square or rectangular, make sure you want it to appear as little like the form that you poured it in as possible. Did you know you can pour plaster in a Pringles can? I watched a tutorial where a guy did that and then carved this really beautiful figure sitting on this cylinder. It was gorgeous. So really think, if possible, what shape and what you want your final design to look like, and kind of pick out a mold that serves and makes it easier to kind of get to that final shape. So the plaster, again, I can't believe how lucky I am, how easy it is to carve through, and I'm going to try and connect this hole to this one. Again, it's harder to carve as it sets and as it cures. So my advice is get as much of the big stuff done the first day of carving, which is the second day of plaster, and really try and get a ton done that first and second class period if you're doing it at school. If you're doing it at home, definitely get a general shape, because if you wrap it up and come back to it, it will eventually cure and set and get as hard as a rock, which is the end goal, but it does make it incredibly frustrating to work with. I'm going to put a link to my materials in the description box, because I bought some of these carving tools that I'm just really loving. Again, I'm getting dentist vibes here, but just to carve in those little areas and for fine details, I'm barely using the rasps at all, and I'm really focusing on these little chiseling tools. They just make for really great, detailed, small, negative space areas. I'm enjoying that I don't have an end result, I don't know what this is looking like, but again, if you don't know where to start, just start, but I would pre-plan what you want your design to look like before jumping in. Keep in mind, I've been teaching a while. I have a degree in art, so I do have some experience carving. Most of my students have never carved anything before. Maybe when they were kids, they whittled pieces of wood, but that seems like a very 1980s childhood thing to do. Now that we have phones and TikTok, students aren't really sitting around whittling pieces of wood, but So I'm going to do something I don't typically do in my tutorials, and that is I am going to stop talking. Carving takes a long time. My students worked on this for 3 weeks. Again, we did have some students that were quarantined, so it took a little longer than maybe it had to, but the process just takes a lot of time and effort, because carving is, got to use your elbow grease. So I'm just going to stop talking. You can just watch me carve. I'm not going to speed things up or edit anything. I did speed this up a little bit, but I'm not going to time lapse. And you can jump ahead. You'll see the chapters that I put in YouTube. I'll put a little text to let you know when I'm talking again. But I'm just going to carve. You can watch, you can skip ahead, whatever you need at this time. so much negative space, I'm gonna start defining some forms. And I really like these rounded areas. It makes me think of under the sea life, like I mentioned before, and maybe my brain is just in a twisted place, but I'm starting to see like human bodies or human forms where the round areas that you see me rounding out are kind of like intertwined. I could easily turn them into like little snakes too. Ooh, creepy. I think I'm gonna keep mine more abstract. Unfortunately, with these tutorials that I make, it's more about concepts and how to teach others. I don't always have the time to like sit and make it more of a thoughtful or conceptual piece. I would love to be an art student again where I could sit and look at this and really spend my time developing it. But this is a functional video. It's to help my students understand the technique, and then hopefully they will have the time and energy to expand on their ideas. Do you see people like hugging or embracing? Is that just me? That could be a really fun direction to go. Carve like little faces, almost like an angry mob. I don't know, maybe my imagination is running a little too wild, but as you can see, I'm spending a little bit more time defining each form. And this is where it'd be helpful to know what I'm doing. Is it a tree? Is it coral? Is it an angry mob of people? Is it a Medusa snake nest? I don't know, we'll see. I'm gonna speed things up to double time, and I'm gonna be quiet again, and you can either zoom ahead to the next chapter or just keep watching me work. The thought process of what I'm doing has not changed. Looking at it from all angles, developing form, going in to create areas that recede, and creating holes or negative space in the sculpture. So I'm gonna just speed this up until I move on to the next day. So you'll see a big difference in carving then. I'm embracing the time that I had. I think I stayed late after school to finish this part, trying to get just a really developed form all the way 360-degree view before I put it up for the day. So keep watching or jump ahead and see what I do next. Okay, days later, here we are, and you can see my plaster is dramatically a different color. I have not touched it in days, and actually I filmed this like in October or November, and I'm doing my voiceover in January. I started a new job at a new school this school year, and so sometimes I have time to do things and other times I don't. So that's kind of why my uploading schedule has been crazy, and I just don't have everything quite figured out yet. So what I'm doing with a big fluffy brush is I am dusting off as I carve. Let me zoom in so you can see the difference. You can see how white it is. It's very powdery, and you need to wear a mask while carving plaster. You do not want to be breathing in all these dusty plaster particles. It's really bad for your respiratory system. So keep in mind wearing a mask and really safety goggles at all stages of carving is best. I have one of these carving tools that looks very much like a needle tool. You can see like my dentist tool right there. And so I'm so thankful I spent all that time defining form, because it'd be really difficult when your plaster is this set and this cured to get in there and carve it. Notice I said difficult and not impossible. It'd be really fun to play around with the chisel at this point and see like what I can chisel off. But again, my background is ceramics, and slowly carving with loop tools and these little metal tools just make more sense to my brain. Also, if you chisel, you can break things much more easier. So I'd rather do the slow go method of slowly carving. I am resting my plaster on a sponge because I don't want to break it. I'm holding it pretty hard in my hand, and I don't want to like press down on the table and have it break. The more your plaster gets harder to carve, the more fragile it is as far as dropping it. So keep that in mind. And what I'm doing is I'm just going in and really defining what forms I want from kind of the rough draft I did in my first session. You have a needle tool, it's so great for getting in there and carving those little areas. And I'm just going to make my negative space kind of go through a little bit more, and I'm dusting it as I go, and also making these little spheres, these little round areas, making them a little bit more defined, including those longer areas that kind of wave through. At this point, I could easily turn this into like a group of people. I could make it something more realistic, but I think I'm just going to embrace the whole organic, abstract quality that I'm creating and not commit to making something recognizable as far as subject matter, but just interesting shapes and forms, and really just exploring the basics of what a sculpture is, which is a three-dimensional work of art interesting from all sides. Like before, I'm going to be repeating my steps, same as I did before, focusing on rounding, carving, finding those interesting areas. So keep watching. I'm going to speed things up to double time again, and then I'll let you know in the chapters when I'm going to speak again. Okay, I'm coming back to this sculpture weeks later. We've already had Christmas break. I have a new group of students now, but I wanted to finish my video and kind of refine my original ideas. So I'm just cleaning it up a little bit with a brush, and I'm going to kind of dust it off and really ask myself, what do I want this sculpture to represent? What do I want it to look like? Again, I'm coming back at this after quite a lot of time apart. So really the plaster has cured completely. Technically this could be done. I could spray it with a clear coat. There's no moisture whatsoever. It's completely dry, completely set, completely cured. However, I'm just not quite happy. It doesn't look completely finished. Sure, it's abstract. I could just call it quits, but I have this skull sitting on my desk because my Art 2 students are working with the human face and facial proportions. So I randomly have a replica of a human skull sitting on my desk, and that has really inspired my work today. So I'm using this needle tool that you can use with clay, but it came with a carving set of sculpture tools that I'll put a link to that in my description box. And I'm just using that to really get those 3D areas that I created as 3D as possible. So I'm kind of carving in areas I've already created, smoothing them out, pushing my negative space, and it's, again, kind of like being at the dentist office. I feel like I'm picking at someone's teeth. And again, it's all about what your goals are. Are you finished? Is your artwork abstract? How much detail does it need? And remember to always look at your work of art in the round. I'm going to speed things up twice the regular speed, and then I'll show you how I'm going to carve some skulls into this abstract work of art. So for my final details, each little round area that I created that originally was going to be like sea coral, I'm starting to carve in eye sockets, some light indications for teeth. You can see there. I don't know, there's something about this sculpture that always made me think of like a group of people, faces. I don't see it as scary. I know that skeletons and skulls could be like really frightening. I don't know, it kind of has like a Pirates of the Caribbean vibe to it. I'm not looking at it as like a hellscape or a scene of death or anything like that. I just felt that the way the sculpture kind of ended up really lent itself to faces, and for some reason the white just made me think of bones. So instead of trying to carve like actual human faces, which would have been cool too, I'm just kind of carving in skulls and all these little round areas that you see. I'm gonna go ahead and speed things up again. It's as simple as carving 2 eye sockets and carving some teeth, and your sculpture is not gonna look just like mine. So you're welcome to watch me. I'm gonna leave this is gonna be one of my longest videos. So I'll leave all the details that I did. I am gonna speed it up because this video would be 3 hours long. It's already over an hour. So watch if you need to, zoom ahead as needed, because your sculpture, it's not like you're copying what I'm doing. You're just using this to get ideas of how to use the materials and how to do a carving, knowing that your subject matter and your end result will be vastly different from mine. One safety thing, you need to wear a mask when carving plaster that is this set. You can see how much fine dust and powder is really getting on my table and my work surface. I'm wearing a mask and I still left school feeling like my nose was a little stopped up. So double mask if you need to, wear a mask with a respirator if you have asthma or any issue like that. And wearing a mask when using materials that you're carving is so important. You don't want to sit in a dust of dangerous materials. A little bit of plaster of Paris isn't going to harm you, but long exposure or breathing in large amounts, it's just not healthy. It's just not good for your respiratory system. How do you know that you're finished? That is a question I never know the answer to. And you've heard me say this before. If this were my work of art that I was just doing for my own artistic growth, I would spend way more time sculpting, maybe even add like little bodies to my characters. But this is a tutorial for my students to learn how to use materials, how to do a technique. And so I'm gonna wrap this up just because of my own personal time limit. I could sit here and really carve something with much more detail, but I think I captured the essence of what I wanted, a little bit of realism splashed in with a abstract organic sculpture using the subtractive carving technique. Once you're finished, you want to dust the whole thing off, tap it on the table gently to get all the extra dust off of it. Use a hairdryer if you need to, because the final step is to spray it with a clear coat. If you don't spray it, then it always is going to create dust. This clear glaze will make it a little bit shiny, and it'll also seal in the material so that it won't, there it fell over, so that it won't make dust. And I'm gonna do, you can see I'm spraying very closely to it. Do this outside. I'm using a clear coat, but if you want it to be matte, that's totally fine too. And the beauty of plaster is it has a really nice finished look to it with that beautiful kind of white, off-white effect. I was in a hurry, so I knocked it over, and I did break off one of my little skeleton heads. Oh, there he is. So I just sprayed it. I actually know that Elmer's glue works really well to fix it, so I'm gonna let it dry overnight, and then I'll come back and re-glue that little skeleton head. Before I finish mine, I want to show you some of my student examples that really stood out. Some of them, as you can see, are purely abstract, focusing on organic abstraction, and some of them have more realism, like the hugging couple, the owl, of course, that skeleton face, which I love, and then the bird in a nest. I also love the one that's brightly painted. You can use acrylic paint to make your designs come to life as well. There's so many great examples, and there's so many opportunities because you can keep it completely abstract or focus in on subject matter that you find interesting. Also, shout out to my students for making this in 2021 when so many of them were quarantined and had time away from the classroom. They came back and just rocked it. Find a wooden base, and this one was already painted by one of my students last semester. They just didn't use it, so I'm going to borrow that forever. And I'm going to attach the plaster to the base with a glue called E6000. It's a really strong hold glue. Just be careful using any super glue or any heavy duty glue. Read the directions. This one's a little bit stinky, so you want to make sure you put it in a well ventilated area. And you don't want to like touch the glue and have it absorb through your skin. So don't eat anything while using it. Wash your hands after use. And it depends on the glue you're using. I've tried hot glue with this with not great results. The E6000 or the Gorilla Super Glue have been the best glue to use to attach it to a base. And it just makes it look finished, refined, like you find it in an art museum. So with any broken pieces, I'm gonna use my Elmer's glue to reattach it, and it works really well. It's thin, so it doesn't create like an extra layer. It fills in the cracks and crevices, it dries clear. It works just really well with plaster, so don't worry about using super glue or anything like that with broken pieces. Now, if you broke it like clear in half, that would be different, but I still think that the Elmer's glue would do the right job. So you can leave your sculpture pure white with that clear coat on it, nice and shiny, and keep things simple. Or you can paint it with acrylic paint, you can spray paint it, you can do an India ink resist technique, which I will make a video about because it's my favorite way to really enhance the carved areas. Well, I think she's done. A little creepy, but really fun to make. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more tutorials, check these out. Find me on Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado to see what my students are up to in my classroom. And if you're interested in my lesson plans, student examples, and any free resources, find my website, thatartteacher.com.